Welcome back. You're watching Political Exchange, where we continue our discussion on the mineral energy complex in South Africa. Just before the break, we were getting into this idea of what are we comparing. Claude was making the point that South Africa's wage bill is incredibly high, and you were just interjecting, saying, what are we comparing it to?
The question is,
your thoughts.
if you are saying very high, comparing to who? To economies of our size? No. That's definitely not the same.
Claude?
I mean, it's known that South Africa has
I
wages.
mean, an example, I mean, talk about, I was just made a calculation in a restaurant in Mauritius.
Yeah.
Those far paid than South African restaurant workers.
No, I mean, it's true that in terms of absolute labor costs, South Africa is broadly competitive, and it is certainly more competitive than a lot of our African peers. But in terms of the real productivity of labor, which is the real measure of cost competitiveness, there is a real problem.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem comes from the fact that we've allowed our wage inflation effectively run away from us and increase far more rapidly than inflation itself, and far greatly than productivity gains.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the key problem. And the fear that I have, and that a lot of us analysts have, is that what it's going to lead is that it's going to lead to an increase in the shift of South African industries and effectively productive sectors towards ever more capital-intensive, technology-intensive, labor-replacing technologies. And that in its turn is going to feed the monster which we are now experiencing, which is a population of unemployed people that are increasingly unemployable because they simply don't have the skills. And they are simply too costly at an entry level to be able to be incorporated into the system. Mm-hmm. And so that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the fiscal situation of the state. It stresses the macroeconomic framework, which has been very good and is holding up this country together. And it feeds into populism, and it feeds into instability.
Let me come in here on the issue of macroeconomic policy. We've had the policy conference. A lot of people argue that we're not very clear on what the way forward is, particularly when it comes to the mineral energy complex. We've spoken to the Secretary General of the African National Congress, who's made it very clear that wholesale nationalization is off the table, but we are talking about strategic nationalization of particular minerals. Let's come to the question around macroeconomic policy and the issue around monetary policy. COSATU has consistently argued that there's an implicit bargain in this alliance where it gets the right to win on issues around labor relations, but the fiscal conservatives, if you like, control monetary policy, and they asking for a radical shift. Mr. Godongwana, what are we likely to see coming out of the elective conference on monetary policy? Are you going to make a U-turn?
Let me just start with the mining issue. The policy conference resolution clearly, if you look under the mineral sector, there's no reference to nationalization at all. Mm-hmm. What we have done, we've talked about a strategic nationalization in a broader resolution, mm-hmm. which restates the 1992 policy position of the ANC in terms of the ready to govern. Mm-hmm. So I just want to clarify that in relation to monetary policy, we've got to say, I don't want you to come up and say there's a blank, there's a kind of a blueprint. Mm. What the critics of monetary policy have got to say to us, it has been the weakness in monetary policy is that weakness has had these serious implications for the economy. An example, people have been saying a lot about the value of the currency. Mm-hmm. And
isn't the question volatility rather than value, Mr. Godongwana?
The value of currency, I'm not sure whether that debate becomes relevant now. So all I'm trying to say to you, for me, I'm going into that debate with an open mind. But the way that debate, we agreed that is a debate we've got to do not in the heat of elective conference. It's a debate we've got to do in a rational debate over the past few months before the elective conference.
Mm-hmm. Claude?
Well, if we take just the issue of the currency, it has been a huge debate for years in this country. Labor Union has been asking for a more loose monetary policy which would allow effectively the currency to come down, and that would make the country more competitive because wages would relatively decline. But the reality is that I'm not sure it's a good solution for South Africa. because the country, again, has a fairly small working population and its industrial base is relatively constrained compared to our import bill. The reality is that, and it's been proven over and over in history, is that countries that let their currency go down tend to see an increase in inflation, and that tends to hurt the poor who are relying on imported staple for survival.
But if you look at economic policy, industrial policy is very much at the center of the way in which South Africa is beginning to frame its economic policy. Minister Rob Davies, Ibrahim Patel are on the record, and they point to the bigger economies and say no economy has grown without industrial policy, stated or unstated.
Absolutely, and I think there is no doubt that industrial policy is the foundation of long-term sustainable wealth and growth in emerging countries. That cannot be debated, and we are all supportive of the fact that South Africa needs to have a coherent industrial policy. The question is the industrial policy that is being followed right now, which is somewhat state-centric, somewhat protectionist, that does not address the issue of cost competitiveness of labor and electricity in an effective way, is that the right route? If we look at what's happening in mining right now, which is possibly a harbinger of what's going to happen in the rest of the economy, then the answer tends to be no, it is not the right route. We're going to end up with a much smaller workforce, which is paid possibly higher than it needs to be paid in terms of the competitiveness and in terms of what the industrial policy itself requires. And we're going to be effectively having a very small, fairly narrow industrial base with a state, again, that is stressed itself to the breaking point fiscally because it is trying to accommodate both welfare requirements and state requirements.
Mr. Godongwana, let me bring you in here. The government's bedrock for economic growth at the moment is its massive infrastructure rollout plan. And of course, that is tied to its understanding of the state's role in the economy, and a key issue there is industrialization. What Claude is saying is he's saying that it's not necessarily the way to go. I spoke with Dr. Abidian recently, and he was saying that if you look at the infrastructure rollout plan, it's in many ways just a way to accommodate the mining magnates, and you're not talking to industrialists in our economy. There's no broader vision for where infrastructure is meant to take us.
Look, let's start with the following point: is that everybody, from whatever angle, you can develop a critique of the infrastructure plan. But let me just say one of the positive aspects: we've got a huge deficiency in infrastructure that we should turn into a positive. Rolling out that infrastructure opens the mining industry as well, but it opens different other opportunities across the country. For instance, the dams in Transkei are not intended for the mining industry at all, but it opens that opportunity. There may be limits in terms of how the construct of that infrastructure may be. Take the ports, rail, and so on. Really, what we need to do is we need to have a focus, as we did in electricity, have a national plan. At the moment of operation within the confines of a plan developed by Transnet, which also depends on the balance sheet of Transnet. That is also a critique of the genuine critique of the plan, which we need to, as we go along, it should not be saying let's be static and let's move and roll out that infrastructure. It's going to open up huge opportunities in this economy.
Let me just put you on the spot and say, what is it that the state, from the ANC's point of view, wants from the business community? Because there is no way you can do this on your own. Government is committed to what it calls a mixed economy, so there's a definite role for business. But a lot of people find it incredibly hard to understand what exactly you're expecting from them.
The difficulty you have in South Africa, a bridge we need to cross. There's mistrust between ourselves and business.
What is the origins of that mistrust, Mr. Godongwana?
It's origin of the ANC itself. Is perception that you can see the distinction even between our debate now, this conceptualization of our Marxist background and centrist and so on and so on. So that an ideological issue which has kind of constrained a constructive debate. So the first stadium of this debate is how do you grow this economy as a whole? Working together. Another structural constraint is skills. We're not seeing that rollout emerging from the private sector. There has been some improvement from ESCOM and other state-owned institutions to give you content to the skills formation in this economy. So we need a different kind of of kind of conversation.
Claude?
Yeah, you know, and business, I think business and government indeed have, I mean, the NC have a long history of distrust, which has historical causes.
Let me just come in here. What Chris Hart was saying in one of the newspapers this morning, he's not so much worried about foreign direct investment, he's worried about local business not having confidence in the economy. Why are they not having confidence in the economy?
Because I think you've said it in one instance, there is lack of signal, that lack of a clear message from government as to which way they're going. In some cases, the framework, you know, the legislative framework is unclear.
But others would argue that business is so used to comfort and protection that it's really not coming to the party. It amounts to a local investment strike. I mean, we've got, what, 500 billion locked up?
Correct. I think there's an issue of confidence, there's an issue of clarity, there's an issue of cost competitiveness. I struggle to see you know, why we cannot, for instance, liberalize our port and airport offering. We have enormous problems that you've raised about a balance sheet of Transnet. We have enormous problems with the balance sheet of Eskom. We are relying on these parastatals to effectively power up the economy and create the condition for growth. But because they are not sufficiently capitalized, because the state is being stressed in all these directions, we are go slow on a go slow mode. So there's a recognition we need infrastructure, but the infrastructure is being rolled out too slowly, uncompetitively positioned and uncompetitively priced. So for me, the concern becomes great to have all that infrastructure, you know, but if it is too costly, then people will stop investing and they'll go somewhere else to find infrastructure they need.
Last word from Ina?
I think when we talk about this infrastructure, we kind of throw this generalize about the state-owned enterprises, whereas the kind of a difference, if you look at electricity, we'll have a different argument. For instance, I may argue that, in fact, the problem you have is the cost of energy, which impacts on the cost of electricity. 50% of the cost of what Eskom does is coal, which has been liberalized at the moment. So we need, that's why I'm saying instead of throwing these things, we need to find a consensus and discuss what do we do with the cost of electricity, and how do we deal with the logistic chain. I do believe that we should not be depending on Transnet's balance sheet. At some point, we've got to make concessions on some of the rail lines.
Gentlemen, we obviously have many, many things to talk about still, and I'm sure this is a conversation that will continue for a very long time in the attempt to find common cause on dealing with, you know, those triple challenges that we've identified. But we're unfortunately out of time. That's where we have to leave it. That's where we leave it for Political Exchange. Join me again tomorrow night for another edition of the program. I'm Karima Brown. Goodbye.